What if the woman they suspended for saving a life had more battlefield experience than every doctor in that hospital combined? Sarah Mitchell, 38, had spent 10 years performing emergency surgeries in war zones, Syria, Afghanistan, Somalia. Places where credentials didn't matter. Only skill did. But when she returned to America with nerve damage and an expired license, she couldn't prove any of it without risking legal consequences for practicing medicine beyond her scope. So she took a job as a nursing assistant at Mercy General Hospital in Chicago. Minimum wage. Night shifts. Invisible. For 5 years, Dr. Marcus Whitfield, 42, chief of emergency medicine, made her life hell. "You're not a real nurse," he'd say in front of everyone. "You're just a glorified assistant with a fake credential." Sarah never responded. She just kept working. Kept her head down. Kept her secrets buried. Until the night a 16-year-old boy arrived bleeding in the ER. Dr. Whitfield looked at the father's Medicaid card and said 4 words that would end his career. "Take him to county." The boy had 10 minutes before his lung collapsed. Sarah had a choice: follow the rules and watch him die, or break protocol and reveal the secret she'd buried for 5 years. She chose the boy. And when a 4-star general walked into that hospital 3 hours later asking for the nurse who saved my friend's son, Dr. Whitfield's world shattered. If you believe experience matters more than a diploma, comment respect. Sarah Mitchell's alarm went off at 4:30 a.m. in her small studio apartment on Chicago's west side. Through the window, she could see Mercy General Hospital, 5 blocks away, the place where she'd worked night shifts for the past 5 years. On her bedside table sat a locked metal box. Inside were documents she hadn't looked at in years, commendations from Doctors Without Borders, letters from field surgeons she'd worked alongside in Aleppo and Kandahar, photographs of makeshift operating rooms in bombed-out buildings. Also in that box, the medical board complaint that had forced her to stop practicing. Performing surgical procedures beyond nursing scope of practice in conflict zones, it read. Potential liability upon return to United States. The lawyers had been clear: if she tried to get licensed as a nurse practitioner and disclosed what she'd done overseas, she could face legal action. Even though she'd saved hundreds of lives, even though she'd worked in places where no doctors were available, the law didn't care about context. So Sarah had made a choice. She got a certificate as a nursing assistant, a credential that required no disclosure of her past, and took a job at the first hospital that would hire her. Mercy General. Night shift. $16 an hour. She dressed in her light blue scrubs, the uniform that marked her as support staff, rather than a registered nurse. The distinction mattered at Mercy General. It meant lower pay, less respect, and constant supervision by doctors like Marcus Whitfield. She arrived at the hospital at 5:45 a.m. for her 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. shift. The night shift was always understaffed, always chaotic, and always where Sarah ended up because no one else wanted those hours. Mitchell. Charge nurse Patricia Coleman called from the nurses' station. Dr. Whitfield left specific instructions. "You're on supply restocking tonight. No patient contact." Sarah nodded quietly. Understood. Supply restocking. After 10 years of performing emergency thoraco. Dr. Marcus Whitfield was a legend at Mercy General Hospital. At 42, he was the youngest chief of emergency medicine in the hospital's 75-year history. Johns Hopkins Medical School. Residency at Massachusetts General. Published researcher. Brilliant diagnostician. And he knew it. "Where's the Mitchell woman?" Dr. Whitfield asked as he swept into the ER at 7 p.m., an hour late for his shift but confident no one would question him. "Restocking supplies, doctor," said Nurse Coleman. "Good. Keep her away from anything important. I don't want uncertified personnel making decisions in my ER." What Dr. Whitfield didn't know was that 24-year-old medical student James Chen had been quietly observing him for weeks as part of his emergency medicine rotation. And something about Dr. Whitfield's treatment of Sarah Mitchell bothered him deeply. "Dr. Whitfield," James asked carefully during a quiet moment, "I noticed you're very focused on credentials. Has there been a problem with Sarah Mitchell's work?" Dr. Whitfield's eyes narrowed. "Mitchell is a nursing assistant with a certificate from some no-name community college. She has no business making medical decisions. I've tried to get her removed from this ER 3 times, but HR keeps protecting her for some reason." "But has she made mistakes?" James pressed. "That's not the point. The point is hierarchy. Medicine has standards for a reason. You don't let someone without proper credentials near patients, even if they haven't screwed up yet. It's only a matter of time." James wanted to ask more, but Dr. Whitfield was already walking away, barking orders at residents. What neither of them knew was that Sarah Mitchell was in the supply room, quietly checking trauma equipment, something she did every shift even though it wasn't her job. Because in war zones, when everything went wrong, having properly stocked supplies was the difference between life and death. Old habits died hard. 2015, Aleppo, Syria. The makeshift field hospital shook as another shell exploded 2 blocks away. 35-year-old Sarah Mitchell worked steadily, her hands inside a patient's chest cavity, manually compressing his heart while a Syrian doctor tried to repair the damaged artery. "Sarah, we need to evacuate." Dr. Jean-Pierre Moreau shouted over the chaos. "The building is being targeted." "Not until this bleeding stops," Sarah replied calmly, her voice steady despite the explosions. "He'll die in 90 seconds if we move him now." Dr. Moreau watched in amazement as Sarah's hands moved with impossible precision despite the building literally shaking around them. "Where did you learn to do this?" he asked. "Afghanistan. Before that, Somalia. You learn fast when there's no choice and no backup." Sarah had never intended to become a field surgeon. She'd gone to nursing school in the United States, graduated with honors from Northwestern, and planned to work in pediatric care. But when her younger brother, a Marine medic, was killed in Helmand province in 2009, something in Sarah broke and reformed. She joined Doctors Without Borders 8 months later. Just an RN license and an unshakable determination to save the lives that others couldn't or wouldn't. Over the next 10 years, Sarah worked in the most dangerous conflict zones on Earth. She learned to perform procedures that most nurses never touched: emergency chest tubes, field amputations, even emergency C-sections when no doctors were available. She learned from surgeons who were too desperate and too overwhelmed to care about hierarchy or credentials. And she got good. Really good. 2016, Kandahar, Afghanistan. "Sarah, you just performed a bilateral chest decompression with 2 ballpoint pens," Dr. Moreau said after a particularly brutal day. "That's not nursing. That's advanced trauma surgery." Sarah cleaned the blood from her hands. "Tell that to the patient. He's breathing, isn't he? You should go to medical school. With your experience, you'd be an extraordinary surgeon." Sarah shook her head. "I don't need a degree to do this work. And out here, nobody cares about credentials. They care about whether you can save lives." But that perspective would change in 2018, when everything fell apart. 2018, Syrian-Turkish border. The convoy had been ambushed. For Doctors Without Borders staff were dead, 3 more critically wounded. Sarah had been performing emergency surgery in the back of an armored truck when an RPG struck 20 feet away. She woke up in a Turkish hospital 4 days later with a shattered left hand and nerve damage that would end her surgical career forever. The microsurgical precision she developed over a decade, the ability to tie off tiny blood vessels, to work in millimeters, was gone. She could still use the hand for basic tasks, but the fine motor control that made her an exceptional trauma specialist was destroyed. At 38, Sarah Mitchell's decade in the field was over. She returned to the United States with PTSD, nightmares, and a professional crisis that threatened to destroy what was left of her life. Her nursing license had expired while she was overseas. The procedures she'd performed in war zones, surgeries that had saved over 300 documented lives, were technically beyond her legal scope of practice as a nurse. If she tried to get relicensed and told the truth about what she'd been doing, she could face criminal charges for practicing medicine without a license, even though it had been in humanitarian emergencies where normal rules didn't apply. A lawyer had been blunt: "You saved lives, but you broke the law. The medical board won't care about context. They'll see liability." So Sarah made a choice. She got certified as a nursing assistant, a credential that required no disclosure of her past work, and took a job at the first hospital that would hire her for night shifts. Mercy General Hospital. $16 an hour. Invisible. And she told no one who she really was or what she'd done. At 11:47 p.m., the emergency room doors exploded open. "Help! Please, somebody help my son." A man in construction clothes carried a teenage boy who was barely conscious. Blood soaked through makeshift bandages wrapped around the boy's chest. His breathing was shallow, labored, wrong. "What happened?" Nurse Coleman demanded, rushing forward. "Construction accident at the site. Steel beam fell on him. We called 911 but they said 45-minute wait. I couldn't wait. Please, you have to help him." Dr. Whitfield emerged from his office, took one look at the situation, and his face hardened into the expression Sarah had seen 100 times before. The expression that said, "This is a problem, not a patient." "Insurance information?" Dr. Whitfield asked coldly. The father fumbled desperately with his wallet. "I have insurance through the union, but I don't have the card with me. It's at home in my truck. Please, can you just name and social security number for verification?" "What? My son is dying. Can't you just treat him first?" Dr. Whitfield cut him off with a raised hand. "No insurance verification, no treatment. Hospital policy." He turned to Nurse Coleman. "Call County General and arrange a transfer ambulance." The room went silent. Several nurses exchanged shocked glances, but no one spoke up. Dr. Whitfield's authority was absolute in this ER. The father's voice broke. "Please. Please, he's 16 years old. He's my only child. I'll get you the insurance card, I swear to God, but he needs help now." "County General has an excellent trauma unit," Dr. Whitfield said, already turning back toward his office. "The ambulance will be here in 20 minutes. Keep him comfortable until then." Sarah stood at the supply station, her hands gripping the counter so hard her knuckles went white. She could see the boy from where she stood. 16, maybe 17. Pale. Breathing shallow and rapid. Lips starting to turn blue. Classic signs of hemothorax, blood filling the chest cavity and compressing the lungs. 20 minutes was too long. The boy wouldn't make it. Sarah had seen this exact injury pattern 43 times in Syria and Afghanistan. Without immediate intervention, he'd suffocate on his own blood within 15 minutes. "Mitchell," Nurse Coleman said quietly, reading her expression. "Don't even think about it." Dr. Whitfield gave a direct order. But Sarah was already moving. "Get him on a gurney," Sarah said, her voice carrying an authority that made everyone in the ER turn and stare. It wasn't loud. It wasn't aggressive. But it was the voice of someone who had commanded field hospitals under mortar fire, and every instinct in the room recognized it. "Mitchell, stop." Nurse Coleman called. "You don't have authorization. Get him on a gurney. Now." Sarah didn't raise her voice, but something in her tone made two orderlies immediately comply. Dr. Whitfield spun around from his office doorway, his face purple with rage. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Sarah was already examining the boy, her hands moving with practiced efficiency that came from muscle memory trained in the worst conditions imaginable. Checking pulse, weak, thready, 130 beats per minute. Checking pupils, reactive but sluggish. Listening to breath sounds, absent on the left side. Massive hemothorax, left side, she said clinically, her voice calm and precise. Probable rib fractures causing ongoing bleeding. Trachea deviating to the right, tension is building. He needs an emergency chest tube in the next 8 minutes or he'll code. Dr. Whitfield stormed over. You are not authorized to make diagnoses. You are not a doctor. You're barely a nurse. Sarah finally looked up and met his eyes directly for the first time in 5 years. The fear that had kept her silent, that had made her invisible, evaporated in the face of a dying 16-year-old boy. You're right. I'm not a doctor, she said quietly. But I've performed this exact procedure 43 times in field hospitals in Syria, Afghanistan, and Somalia. This boy has maybe 8 minutes before complete cardiovascular collapse. So you have 2 choices, treat him yourself right now, or get out of my way. The ER had gone completely silent. Even the monitors seemed to beep more quietly. Medical student James Chen stood frozen, his phone out, instinctively recording. Dr. Whitfield's mouth opened and closed. You're lying. You have no such experience. This is gross insubordination. You're fired. Security. Then arrest me after I save his life, Sarah said simply, already turning back to the boy. Someone get me a chest tube kit. Size 32 French. Now. And I need a scalpel, lidocaine, and surgical drapes. I gave you a direct order. Dr. Whitfield shouted, his voice cracking. Sarah ignored him, her hands already preparing the boy's chest for the procedure, feeling for anatomical landmarks she'd found in complete darkness during power outages in Aleppo. James, she said to the medical student, her voice steady and commanding, scrub in. Hold pressure on the intercostal space between ribs 5 and 6. Right here. Firm pressure. James hesitated for only a second before moving to help. Something in Sarah's absolute confidence, in the way she moved with surgical precision, overrode his fear of Dr. Whitfield's authority. I'm calling security, Dr. Whitfield sputtered, pulling out his phone with shaking hands. Do whatever you want, Sarah replied without looking up. But if you actually care about this patient's life instead of your ego and your policies, you'll assist me. Because whether you like it or not, I'm the most qualified person in this room to handle this. The challenge hung in the air like smoke. Dr. Whitfield's hand trembled as he held his phone. Around him, the entire ER staff was watching. The father was watching. James Chen's phone was recording everything. And in that moment, Marcus Whitfield had to make a choice, admit that a fake nurse might be right, or let his pride potentially cost a teenage boy his life. The boy gasped, his lips turning darker blue. His oxygen saturation dropped to 82%. Time was up. Fine, Dr. Whitfield said through clenched teeth, his voice barely controlled. Proceed. But I'm supervising every single move. And when this is over, you're answering to the medical board, the hospital administration, and probably the police. Sarah didn't waste breath responding. Her hands moved with the kind of confidence that only came from performing procedures in the worst conditions imaginable, in bombed buildings, in moving vehicles, in complete darkness. James, maintain pressure exactly where I showed you. Nurse Coleman, I need that chest tube kit now. Someone call respiratory therapy to have oxygen ready at 15 liters per minute. This boy's going to need it in about 2 minutes. As supplies arrived, Dr. Whitfield watched in growing disbelief as Sarah worked with a precision and efficiency he'd rarely seen even among experienced trauma surgeons. Local anesthetic, Sarah said calmly, her voice taking on the teaching tone she'd used with medical students in field hospitals. I'm making an incision between the 5th and 6th ribs at the mid-axillary line. The hemothorax is putting massive pressure on the left lung and heart. Once I insert the tube and create drainage, we should see immediate improvement in breathing and blood pressure. She worked steadily, narrating each step not for Dr. Whitfield but for James and the other medical students and residents who had gathered to watch, drawn by the commotion. In a trauma situation like this, you don't have time for textbook perfection, Sarah explained as she worked, her hands moving with absolute certainty. You need to know anatomy well enough to work by feel, by muscle memory. In Aleppo, I did this procedure in complete darkness during a power outage while the building was being shelled. Your hands learn to read what your eyes can't see. The incision was clean, precise, placed perfectly. The tube insertion was flawless, done with a confidence that suggested she'd done it not dozens but hundreds of times. Within 30 seconds of tube insertion, dark blood began draining from the boy's chest cavity into the collection chamber. 400 cubic centimeters, 600 cubic centimeters, 800 cubic centimeters. And his breathing immediately began to improve. The blue tint started fading from his lips. The father, who had been standing nearby in frozen terror, let out a sob of relief as his son's chest began rising and falling more normally. Blood pressure stabilizing, Nurse Coleman announced, her voice filled with amazement she couldn't quite hide. 92/60. Coming up. Oxygen saturation rising. 85, 88. 91. Sarah continued working, securing the chest tube with practiced efficiency, checking for any additional injuries that might have been masked by the primary trauma. He'll need a chest X-ray to confirm full lung re-expansion and rule out additional rib fractures or organ damage, Sarah said, stepping back to assess her work. But he's stable now. He's going to be okay. She looked at the father, whose face was streaked with tears. Your son is going to live. The tube will stay in for a few days while the bleeding stops and the lung fully re-expands, but he'll make a complete recovery. The father tried to speak but couldn't. He just nodded, holding his son's hand. Dr. Whitfield stood motionless, watching this woman he dismissed as incompetent perform a life-saving procedure with a skill level that matched or exceeded the best trauma surgeons he trained with at Mass General. Where? He started, his voice hoarse. Where did you really learn to do this? Sarah finally looked up at him, wiping blood from her gloved hands. Doctors Without Borders. 10 years. Syria, Afghanistan, Somalia, Yemen. I've performed emergency procedures in conditions that would make your residency look like a vacation. I've saved lives in bombed-out buildings with supplies I scavenged from rubble. I've done chest tubes with pen casings when we ran out of proper equipment. I've performed emergency C-sections in the back of moving trucks under sniper fire. She paused, her eyes meeting his with an intensity that made him look away. But when I came back to the United States with nerve damage that ended my surgical career and an expired nursing license, I couldn't prove any of it without risking criminal prosecution for practicing medicine beyond my scope. So I took a job as a nursing assistant, kept my mouth shut, and tried to help where I could without drawing attention. The ER remained silent except for the steady beep of the boy's heart monitor, stronger now, regular, alive. Until tonight, Sarah continued quietly, when you decided that insurance paperwork was more important than a human life. That's when I decided I didn't care about keeping secrets anymore. That's when I decided that if I was going to lose everything, at least I'd lose it saving a life instead of watching someone die. Dr. Whitfield's face had gone from red to white to gray. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. Medical student James Chin was still recording on his phone. Every word. Every moment. Every second of Sarah's confession and Dr. Whitfield's silent horror. Dr. Whitfield, James said quietly, holding up his phone. I think you need to see this. He pulled up a quick web search on his phone and held it out, Sarah Mitchell Doctors Without Borders. The results were extensive. Articles. Commendations. Photographs of a younger Sarah in field hospitals wearing the Doctors Without Borders vest. A feature article in The Atlantic from 2017, the nurse who became a surgeon in the world's most dangerous war zones. A CNN profile. A documentary short. Dr. Whitfield stared at the screen, his face a mixture of shock, humiliation, and the dawning realization of what he'd done, not just tonight, but for 5 years. 5 years of dismissing, belittling, and trying to destroy someone who had more practical trauma experience than anyone in this hospital. Around them, phones were coming out. Staff members Googling. Whispers spreading. "She's the angel of Aleppo. I remember reading about her. 300 documented lives saved." Dr. Whitfield looked from the phone to Sarah to the boy who was alive because she'd broken every rule he held sacred. And for the first time in his career, Marcus Whitfield had absolutely nothing to say. By midnight, hospital administration had been called in. The boy, Michael Torres, was stable in the ICU, his father refusing to leave his bedside. But downstairs in the ER, the fallout was just beginning. Sarah sat in a small conference room, still in her blood-stained scrubs. Across from her sat Hospital Administrator Richard Hayes and Chief of Staff Dr. Patricia Okafor. Dr. Whitfield stood by the window, arms crossed, his back to everyone. "Ms. Mitchell," Hayes began carefully, "we need to understand exactly what happened tonight. I performed an emergency chest tube insertion on a patient who was dying because your chief of emergency medicine refused to treat him without insurance verification," Sarah said evenly. "I saved a 16-year-old boy's life. Now you probably want to fire me and possibly press charges. So let's just get that over with." Dr. Okafor shook her head. "Actually, Ms. Mitchell, we want to understand why someone with your qualifications has been working as a nursing assistant for 5 years. She slid a tablet across the table showing Sarah's entire history, articles, commendations, the Atlantic feature, CNN profile, everything. "Our legal team has spent the last hour researching your background," Hayes added. "You're not just experienced. You're legendary in humanitarian medical circles. The Angel of Aleppo, they called you." Sarah said nothing, her jaw tight. "The procedures you performed overseas," Dr. Okafor said gently, "were done under emergency circumstances in active war zones. You had no legal exposure for those actions. They were humanitarian exceptions. But when you returned, you chose not to disclose that experience. Why?" For the first time that night, Sarah's composure cracked slightly. Her hands trembled as she folded them on the table. "Because I didn't think anyone would believe me," she said quietly. "Or care. I'm not a doctor. I have nerve damage that ended my surgical career. And the lawyers told me that if I disclosed what I'd done, even in war zones, I could face liability claims, malpractice accusations, practicing medicine without a license. So I just disappeared. Took the smallest job I could find. Tried to help in whatever small ways I was allowed. And Dr. Whitfield made your life hell for 5 years because you didn't have the right credentials," Hayes said, his voice hard. He turned to Whitfield. "We've been reviewing your emails and documented complaints. You've tried to get Ms. Mitchell fired 3 times. You've publicly humiliated her repeatedly. You've systematically undermined and belittled her." Dr. Whitfield didn't turn around. His shoulders were rigid, his reflection in the window showing a face drained of all color. "Where is Dr. Whitfield now in this conversation?" Sarah asked quietly. "Suspended pending investigation," Dr. Okafor replied. "Not just for tonight, though refusing to treat a dying patient is grounds for immediate termination, but for a pattern of discrimination, harassment, and what we're now learning might constitute creating a hostile work environment." Sarah blinked. I don't understand. Shouldn't you be firing me? For saving a life?" Hayes leaned forward. "Ms. Mitchell, in the next 24 hours, this hospital is going to face intense scrutiny. A medical student's video of tonight's events is already going viral. We're getting calls from veteran groups, medical ethics boards, and 3 different news stations." He paused. "We need to get ahead of this. And having someone of your caliber on staff, someone who represents the very best of what emergency medicine should be, that's exactly what Mercy General needs." Dr. Okafor opened a folder. We'd like to offer you a position as our emergency trauma consultant. We'll sponsor your RN license reinstatement. With your documented experience, you'll qualify immediately. Salary of $95,000 annually with full benefits. You'll work with our trauma teams, train residents, and coordinate with our emergency response protocols. Sarah stared at them, unable to process what she was hearing. You'll never have to be invisible again, Dr. Okafor said softly. Sarah sat alone in the hospital chapel, still unable to fully comprehend what had happened. She'd saved a life. Revealed her past. And somehow, instead of losing everything, she'd been offered more than she'd ever imagined possible. She was staring at her hands, the ones with nerve damage that had ended her surgical career but had just saved Michael Torres, when she heard footsteps behind her. Ms. Mitchell? She turned to find a man in military dress uniform standing in the chapel doorway. The silver eagles on his shoulders marked him as a full colonel. But that wasn't what made Sarah's breath catch. She recognized his face. Colonel Bradley, she whispered. Colonel Thomas Bradley smiled slightly. It's General now. 4 stars. And I've been looking for you for 3 years. Sarah stood slowly, her mind racing back to Kandahar, 2016. A convoy ambush. Multiple casualties. She'd worked for 18 straight hours, performing emergency procedures in impossible conditions. One of the soldiers she'd saved had been a young captain named Thomas Bradley. You disappeared, General Bradley said, walking into the chapel. After that ambush, after you saved my life and 6 others, you were gone. Doctors Without Borders said you'd left the program. No forwarding address. It was like you'd vanished. I had to, Sarah said quietly. The lawyers said. I know what the lawyers said, Bradley interrupted gently. And they were wrong. I've spent the last hour with your hospital's administration and with the Judge Advocate General's office. There are no charges. There never were. What you did was humanitarian medical service in active combat zones. It's protected under international law and U.S. military regulations. He reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope. This is a commendation from the Department of Defense. Should have been given to you 3 years ago, but we couldn't find you. He handed it to her. And this, he pulled out a second envelope, is a job offer from the VA, Regional Emergency Medical Coordinator. Training, protocol development, trauma consultation. $120,000 annual salary. We need people who understand battlefield medicine and can teach the next generation. Sarah's hands shook as she took the envelopes. General, I don't understand. How did you even know I was here? Bradley smiled. A medical student posted a video 3 hours ago. Nursing assistant reveals she's a war zone surgeon. It's already got 200,000 views. My chief of staff called me at 2 a.m. to show me. The moment I saw your face, I knew. He stepped closer, his voice softening. You saved my life, Sarah. You saved 6 other soldiers that day. And based on what I've read about tonight, you just saved a 16-year-old kid from dying because of bureaucratic nonsense. I broke protocol, Sarah said quietly. You saved a life, Bradley corrected. There's a difference. The next morning, Sarah returned to Mercy General, not as a nursing assistant but as a consultant. She wore business casual clothes, carried a hospital badge that said, Emergency Trauma Consultant, and walked through doors that had been closed to her for 5 years. The ER was buzzing with activity. Staff members stopped and stared as she walked through. Some smiled. Some looked away, embarrassed by their previous silence. Dr. Whitfield was in administration's office, meeting with HR and legal counsel. When Sarah passed by the glass-walled conference room, their eyes met. For 5 years, his gaze had made her feel small, invisible, worthless. Now, he was the one who looked away first. Administrator Hayes waved her into his office. Ms. Mitchell, glad you're here. We need to discuss Dr. Whitfield's situation. What situation? Sarah asked, sitting down. He submitted his resignation, effective immediately. But there's a complication. Hayes pulled up a video on his laptop. It was James Chen's recording from the night before, but edited together with other clips: Sarah treating Michael Torres, General Bradley's arrival at the hospital that morning, interviews with other ER staff. The video had 7 million views. This went viral overnight, Hayes said. The story is everywhere. CNN, MSNBC, Fox News. Hospital suspends war hero nurse, general intervenes. The optics are complicated. Complicated how? Sarah asked. Dr. Whitfield wants to issue a public apology. His lawyers think it might help. But it needs to be genuine, not just damage control. Hayes paused. We wanted to ask you first. Do you want to hear what he has to say? Sarah thought about 5 years of humiliation. 5 years of being called fake and unqualified. 5 years of keeping her head down and accepting that she deserved to be invisible. Yes, she said finally. I'll hear him out. They met in the same conference room where Sarah had been questioned the night before. Dr. Whitfield sat across from her, looking like he'd aged 10 years overnight. His eyes were red-rimmed, his shoulders slumped. Ms. Mitchell, he began, his voice hoarse. I need to apologize. Not because the hospital is making me, or because my lawyers think it'll help, but because I was wrong. Completely, inexcusably wrong. Sarah said nothing, just watched him carefully. For 5 years, I treated you like you were beneath me because you didn't have the credentials I valued, Whitfield continued. I never asked about your background. Never looked beyond the title on your badge. I just assumed that anyone working as a nursing assistant wasn't worthy of respect. He paused, his hands trembling slightly. Last night, I let my ego and my obsession with hierarchy almost cost a 16-year-old boy his life. And you, the woman I'd spent 5 years trying to get fired, you saved him. You did it with a skill level I couldn't match. You did it despite knowing it would cost you everything. It didn't cost me everything, Sarah said quietly. It gave me back something I thought I'd lost. Whitfield looked up at her, confused. My voice, Sarah explained. For 5 years, I stayed silent because I thought that was the only way to survive. You made me feel like I had to earn the right to exist in your ER. But last night, when I saw Michael Torres dying, I remembered why I became a nurse in the first place. Not for credentials or respect or authority. For this. For saving lives when no one else will. She leaned forward. Your apology doesn't change what happened, Dr. Whitfield. But it's a start. And maybe, just maybe, you'll remember this the next time you're tempted to judge someone based on what their badge says instead of what their hands can do. Whitfield nodded slowly, tears finally spilling down his cheeks. I will. I promise you, I will. 6 months after that night in the ER, Mercy General Hospital looked different. Not in structure, but in spirit. Sarah Mitchell, now 39, walked through the halls in professional attire, her badge reading, Emergency Trauma Consultant and Training Director. She'd accepted the hospital's offer instead of the VA position, though she consulted with them regularly. The ER had changed. New protocols ensured that no patient would ever be turned away due to insurance verification delays. A veteran care liaison program provided immediate emergency treatment for former military personnel, no questions asked. And Sarah had started a training program, Battlefield to Bedside, teaching ER staff combat medical techniques that could save lives in the crucial first minutes of trauma. Michael Torres, the 16-year-old boy she'd saved, visited regularly. He'd decided to become a paramedic, inspired by the woman who'd refused to let him die. His father, Roberto Torres, had started a foundation supporting trauma nurse training programs. Dr. Marcus Whitfield had left Chicago entirely, taking a position at a rural hospital in Montana. But before he left, he'd done something unexpected. He'd donated $500,000 to Sarah's training program, funded from his own savings. No press release. No public announcement. Just a letter that said, "To help train the next generation to be better than I was." General Bradley had made good on his promise too. Sarah now consulted with the Department of Defense on trauma protocols, helping transition military medics to civilian healthcare. She'd helped reform policies that had once kept people like her silent about their battlefield experience. The story had spread far beyond Mercy General. Medical schools across the country began reviewing how they evaluated non-traditional experience. Hospitals created pathways for combat medics and field workers to transition into formal healthcare roles. And every week, Sarah received emails from people like her, medics, field nurses, humanitarian workers who'd been told their experience didn't count because it didn't come with the right paperwork. She answered every single one. On a quiet Tuesday morning, Sarah stood in the ER teaching a group of residents how to perform emergency chest decompression. She demonstrated on a training mannequin, her voice calm and clear, explaining each step with the confidence of someone who'd done it in the darkest, most desperate circumstances imaginable. The key, she told them, is not letting fear of making a mistake stop you from taking action. In the field, we had a saying, perfect procedure, dead patient. Good enough procedure, living patient. Don't let protocol kill someone while you're waiting for perfection. One of the residents raised his hand. "Ms. Mitchell, do you ever regret those years working as a nursing assistant? When no one knew who you really were?" Sarah paused, considering the question carefully. "No," she said finally. "Those years taught me something important. Your value as a healthcare provider isn't defined by what's on your badge or your diploma. It's defined by whether you show up when it matters. Whether you do the right thing even when it costs you everything." She looked around at the young faces watching her, the next generation of doctors and nurses who would face their own impossible choices. "Dr. Whitfield taught me that too, in his own way. He showed me what happens when you worship credentials more than you value human life. And he paid a heavy price for that lesson." "Do you think he's a better doctor now?" another resident asked. Sarah smiled slightly. "I hope so. I think everyone deserves a chance to learn from their mistakes. Even the ones who hurt us." As the training session ended and the residents filed out, Sarah's phone buzzed. A text from General Bradley. New training request from Walter Reed. They want the Angel of Aleppo. You available next month? She smiled and typed back, always. Then a second message came in, this one from an unknown number. "Ms. Mitchell, this is Roberto Torres. Michael just got accepted to the paramedic program. He wanted you to be the first to know. Thank you for giving my son a future." Sarah felt tears sting her eyes. She typed back quickly, "Tell him I'm proud. And that the world needs more people like him." She stood in the ER she'd once cleaned late at night, in the hospital where she'd once been invisible, and realized something profound. Sometimes the greatest act of courage isn't the dramatic moment of breaking rules to save a life. It's the years of quiet endurance that come before it. It's showing up every day even when no one sees your value. It's keeping your skills sharp even when no one asks you to use them. It's holding on to who you are even when the world tells you you're not enough. Because when the moment comes, and it always comes, you'll be ready. Not because of what your badge says, but because of who you've always been, waiting in the silence for your chance to speak. If you believe experience matters more than paperwork, hit that subscribe button. If this story reminded you that every person has a hidden depth we can't see, comment respect. And if you know someone who's been told they're not enough because of credentials, share this story. Because sometimes the most qualified person in the room is the one everyone's been ignoring. The world needs more people like Sarah Mitchell. People who break the rules when the rules are wrong. People who stay silent until silence becomes complicity. People who remember that medicine isn't about power, it's about saving lives, no matter what it costs you. That's what real healthcare looks like. That's what real courage looks like. And that's why her story matters.